This training will cover reimbursement requests. I will show you how to create a reimbursement request, reconcile and work within a reimbursement request, and then how to submit the request to the county for approval. Reimbursement requests are used by each agency to request payment for services or expenses for certain service categories. And reimbursement requests are created within the service contract. And the easiest way to get to your service contract is by going to View, Contract Management, Service Contracts by Status. Here you can see all of the open service contracts for your agency. Double-click into the contract or service category that you want to make the reimbursement request for. And on the Reimbursement Request tab is where you can see all past reimbursement requests that were created for this service contract, and it's where you can add new ones by clicking on the Create Reimbursement Request button. One thing to note is that only one pending or submitted reimbursement request is allowed at each time for each service contract. So once you create a reimbursement request or you submit it to the county, you have to wait for them to approve that request before you can submit another one to them. Here I am in a new reimbursement request. And the first thing to do is enter the reimbursement through date. The reimbursement through date is important because only services that are dated between the contract start date and the reimbursement through date will show on this reimbursement request. Typically, you will make one reimbursement request per month, so the reimbursement through date will usually be the last date of the month. After you put the reimbursement through date, you want to make sure that the prepared by, there's 3 fields, are entered incorrectly. The prepared by fields will appear on the reimbursement request when you print it to submit to the county later. So that's why you want to make sure that these 3 fields are entered in correctly. Once you are finished entering the through date and updating the 3 prepared by fields, click on the Save button. The Save button will populate some extra buttons, and once you see those, you'll want to move to the Billable Line Items tab. And which sections appear on the Billable Line Items tab depend on what type of service contract you're in. So if it's just a cost basis service contract, then only this top cost basis expenses section will show. But if it's a fee for service contract, like this one is, then the cost basis and the fee for services sections will show. So first I'm going to go through the cost basis expenses. And the cost basis expenses are created to bill against the non-fee for service line items. To create a new line item, click on the Create Expense Line Item button. Enter in the start date and the end date for this expense. They could be the same day or they could be different days depending on the type of expense. and then click on this small square button to the right hand side of line item category. That will bring up a list of all the line items that are associated with the current service contract. So pick the line item that you want to make this expense for and say OK, and you can see it populates them into this field here. The next thing to fill in is the total expenditure field. The total expenditure field is the total cost of the expense to the agency, but it's not necessarily the amount that is being charged to the county. So once you enter in the total expenditure amount, you can enter either the percentage or the direct amount that you should charge to the reimbursement request or bill to the county. So for example, I can put 50% and I can see only $60 will be billed to the county. Or I can put 0% or 100%. Or I can put in an actual amount. When you are finished, close and say yes to save your changes. And then if I click on that little refresh icon, I can see the expense line item that I just added. If I decide that I actually don't want to bill for this expense, I can simply click on the line to make sure that it's highlighted in that blue color and click on the Move to Unbillable button. Then pick the reason why I'm marking this as unbillable. And if I say OK, I can see it disappeared from the Billable line item tab. So this means that now that line item that I moved to unbillable will not be billed on this reimbursement request. If I want to undo and if I want to move that unbillable line item back to being billable, on the Unbillable Line Items tab, I can click on the item or the line that I moved to unbillable and click on the Clear Moved to Unbillable. That's basically like an undo, so it removes it from being unbillable and puts it back to being billable. So you can switch it back and forth depending on if you want it to be billed to the county or if you don't want it to be billed to the county. The next section in the reimbursement request on the Billable Line Items tab is Fee-for-Service line items. And these line items will pull things such as service provided records, progress logs, payment requests, etc. Basically any billable client activity records that are entered into client files by case managers, etc. And how the fee-for-service line item section works, because you might notice there's no create button. When services are entered into client files, there is a nightly process that takes all of the services and moves them into a behind-the-scenes billing table. And there's a reconcile process in the reimbursement request, which you start by clicking on the reconcile button. And when you click on the reconcile button, the system looks through that billing table that's created or updated each night, and it looks for any billable services that can be billed for this reimbursement request. So it looks for services that are tied to the current service contract, that have a service date that's in between the contract start date and the reimbursement through date, and also services that have not already been billed on a previous reimbursement request. So any services that match those requirements, when I click on the reconcile button, will show in this section. So here I can see 0 ledger records were created. I made a quick adjustment and entered some services to be pulled in. So if I try and reconcile again, I can see now that 3 ledger records were created. So in the billing table that gets updated each night, 3 services met the criteria to pull into this reimbursement request. If I want to see more information about any of these services, because in this view I can see the provider, the service name, the service date, and the amount being billed. But if I want to see anything further, I can click on the line item that I want to see more information about, and I can either open the activity or open the client. Open activity takes me to that specific activity record that was entered into a client file. So here it takes me to the progress log that was entered. And open client takes me into the client profile for the client that the activity was entered into. If any fee-for-service line items pulled into this section that I do not want to bill for in this reimbursement request, I can click on the line item that I do not want to bill for and click on the Move to Unbillable button. Enter the reason that I'm moving it to unbillable and say OK. Now I can see that that line item is now out of the billable line items section because it was moved to the unbillable line items. So this reconcile process can be run multiple times in the reimbursement request if needed. And typically this would be because if any services were entered and provided that were completed after the first reconcile that I did. So like I mentioned, it's a nightly process that takes the services and pulls them into the billing table. So if I enter a service, or if a case manager enters a service into provide today, and I reconcile right now, that service will not show on the reimbursement request because it hasn't pulled into the billing table yet. So if a service is entered today, I would need to wait overnight, and then tomorrow I could come into the reimbursement request and reconcile, and then the service would show. So there is a nightly delay, or an overnight delay. So on the Unbillable Line Items tab, I can see this first line is a line item that I moved from the billable to unbillable. If I want to move this line item back to being billable, so back to being billed on this reimbursement request, I can click on the Clear Moved to Unbillable, it takes it out of unbillable, and if I reconcile again, I can see that the line item is now back on the billable tab. If you move something from unbillable to billable, you have to reconcile again to pull it back into this section, because it's the reconcile process that refreshes this section. But back to the unbillable line items, you might have noticed that there are two other unbillable line items that I did not manually move here. And there are a number of reasons why line items can be automatically put into this unbillable section. The most common reasons are if the client is not eligible for the service that was entered, or if the fee-for-service cap has been exceeded. Usually, the fee-for-service cap being exceeded happens towards the end of the billing contract, but the reason will always show under reject reason. So for these two services, I can see that they are unbillable because for the reason not eligible. And this means that the client was not eligible for this service. And I can further troubleshoot this by using the open unbillable activity or open unbillable client. So here there's a not eligible for March 10th, 2019. If I open unbillable client, it opens up this client's client profile. And if I look at the eligibility tab, I can see that the client their eligibility has been expired since the year 2016. And so that's why the service is being marked as ineligible, because the client's been expired for the last 3 years. So this not eligible line item is correctly showing here. But you would want to go through the unbillable line items and troubleshoot any line items or make any adjustments as needed. If a client is showing as not eligible, but they really should have been eligible, you can make adjustments in the client profile or adjustments to the service date if the wrong service date was entered, for example. But any adjustments that you make, again, because the billing table is updated overnight, any adjustments that you make today, you would have to wait overnight to then see those adjustments in the reimbursement request by tomorrow morning. So again, there's that overnight delay. Lastly, there's this expenditure section, which I was looking at before I started this training, and the expenditure section doesn't seem to be helpful for you guys with the reimbursement request with how it's set up. So I'm going to skip the expenditure section, and you guys should skip the expenditure section as well. So only focus on the cost basis expenses and the fee for service line item section. And you can ignore this section for now. When you have all of the cost basis expenses line items added, you've reconciled, and all of the fee for service line items are showing and the amounts look okay, you can be ready to submit the reimbursement to the county for approval. However, before you can submit the reimbursement request for approval, you first need to print the reimbursement request, and you need to attach a signed copy of the reimbursement request into the request. So when you print the reimbursement request, you're taken to this screen, And at the bottom of the first page are lines for you to sign the request. You need to print the request, sign the request, and then attach the signed copy of the reimbursement request print onto the Attachments tab. One important thing to remember is that you're putting the signed copy of the reimbursement request on the Attachments tab, not the Documents tab. And we try and remind you by having this note here on the Attachments tab that says Attachment Type Signed Copy of Reimbursement Request. Once you have the signed copy of the reimbursement request added to the Attachments tab, then you'll be able to submit the reimbursement request. You will not be able to submit it until you have this attached. Once you have everything ready, you just need to click on the Submit button, which will close you out of the reimbursement request. Now you can see the reimbursement request is in the status of submitted. And that means that the request has gone to the county and it's in queue for them to then process. There is 3 different ways that the county can handle a submitted reimbursement request. The first thing they can do is approve the request, and approving the request clears the way for the reimbursement request to be paid by the county if payment is due. The county can return the request, which sets the status of the reimbursement request from submitted back to a pending status. And then you would be able to go back into the pending reimbursement, make any changes as needed, and then resubmit the reimbursement request back to the county for approval. So a reason for returning the request would be if there's any additional documentation that the county thinks is needed. Whatever the reason for returning is, they will let you know. In the Documents tab of the reimbursement request, what changes are needed for you to make before you can resubmit. The last thing a county can do for reimbursement request is just outright reject the request. That will change the status of the request to rejected, and when a request is rejected, you can't edit the rejected request and resubmit. When a request is rejected, you would have to make a new reimbursement request, start over from the beginning, and then submit it to the county. If the county rejects a reimbursement request, they will provide additional information to you as to why the request was rejected. And again, that additional information of why it was rejected will be shown on the Documents tab of the reimbursement request. You can check back on the status of your reimbursement request at any time, either by coming into the service contract and looking at the reimbursement request tab, or if you have multiple reimbursement requests that are submitted for different service contracts and you don't want to click into each service contract, you want to see them all in one view, you can go to View, Contract Management, Reimbursements by Status. And here you can see all reimbursement requests for your agency, all past ones that have been approved, all pending ones that are waiting to be submitted by you, rejected ones, returned ones, submitted ones, etc. And again, that's just a place for you to come and view all of them rather than clicking into each service contract to get to the reimbursements. That is everything that I had to show you today in regard to the reimbursement requests. As you get started making your own reimbursement requests, I'm sure that you will run into questions. And if you do, you can call or email us at the Provide Help Desk, and we're happy to answer any questions. I have our email and our phone number up on the screen here for you to write down in case you run into any questions.